Welcome everyone to the first session of the Personnel Planning and Optimization course. Today we'll discuss why companies need headcount planning and optimization. As is traditional, this first class is being held in an open format. So there you have it. I asked myself, why would anyone want to learn about this topic? Why do we need personnel planning and headcount optimization? The answer I came up with is that with the knowledge you'll gain in this course, you'll be able to help companies become more efficient and make better use of both staff and money spent on personnel. We'll explore how this works and what it consists of today. This course has a website that looks like this, Pi Workforce. Now a bit about me. My name is Mike Pritula, and I've worked for various companies. I've had to tackle a wide range of personnel-related tasks in different companies, industries, and at various stages of company maturity. In my work, I rely on global best practices. We'll even mention some research today. Obviously, this is important and necessary. I recommend everyone keep track of various publications. For those already enrolled in the course, homework assignments await you. When you successfully complete all the homework, you'll receive our diploma. As you can see, we've updated our diploma design. It looks even more modern and attractive, and it's certainly valued. Employers are already asking about what courses you've taken. And when they hear it's an academy course, it already has value. We issue our diploma on a special online platform. This platform is international, used by many companies, over 100 client companies. Every month, 1 million diplomas are issued on this platform. I've selected the companies you're probably most familiar with. There's Google, Harvard University, Slack, Zendesk, and many others. Your diploma will be alongside these companies on this platform. Let's move on. This course consists of 6 sessions where we'll examine all these topics step by step in detail. Today, we're talking generally about what this field is and why it's needed. Next, we'll discuss how to plan headcount. We'll talk about how to optimize headcount, that is, understanding how many of our current employees we actually need. We'll learn how to optimize this headcount. We'll discuss efficiency because all the previous topics directly depend on how efficiently people work. And we'll talk about how to address various HR strategies and plans using different HR functions, from hiring to downsizing, termination, and so on. These 6 sessions will be dense and packed with information that we'll cover together. Today, we'll break down many fundamental topics. You'll understand what this is, how it works, and how it's implemented in general principles to some extent. Later, we'll get into the techniques of how to do all this. So let's begin. I'll start by saying that headcount and working with personnel is a complex aspect of any large company's operations. For small companies with 10 to 15 people, there are challenges like how to find that one extra person, which represents a 10% increase in staff. There are issues of training effectiveness. Large companies have their own problems. I've selected a few challenges. This is international data. For example, oil and gas companies are postponing major exploration projects despite record prices because there's a shortage of scientists and engineers. Because traditional industries are now less appealing to students than newer fields like IT. Aerospace companies can't meet delivery schedules. Railroad companies are actively seeking a new generation of engineers, drivers, and repair technicians. Energy companies face 5 to 10-year cycles for upskilling in the most critical professions. Some companies are even forced to go beyond universities. Not just recruiting from first-year students, but even going to high schools to ensure people choose the right university and then come work for them. So personnel planning how to solve business challenges with people, is a crucial task for large companies and for medium-sized companies too. That is, if a company has 100 to 120 employees, the issues we're discussing in this course already become relevant. Now, when we talk about personnel, why is it all so complicated? The fact is, staff is expensive. And the more developed an economy becomes, and the more a country's economy resembles leading global economies like the US, the more expensive it gets. When this personnel was relatively cheap, if you look at the average salary in your country, for example, in Ukraine, you might see 120, 130, 150, and so on. And now it's rising, probably heading towards $1,000 and beyond. This constant increase in salary costs makes personnel more expensive and a costlier resource for companies. And we're only talking about salaries here. There are many other types of costs as well. There are salaries, bonuses, benefits, money spent in addition to the base salary. There are shares, stock options, deferred bonuses. In general, there's a lot to consider. There's also a bunch of personnel that aren't even accounted for yet. For example, staff from an outsourced company we hire, like the cleaning service for our office, that's outsourced with many people working there that we don't count. That's a cost too. And there are many invisible hidden costs that companies spend on personnel. First, there are costs from lost work efficiency, because people aren't trained or engaged. Costs from absenteeism or tardiness, costs from low productivity, high turnover, and lots of money spent on filling vacancies. In short, a lot is spent on personnel adaptation. That's why, because the cost of staff is so huge, companies need to approach this more carefully. When you have a cheap resource, you don't really need to worry about efficiency. Hiring 20, 30 more isn't a big deal. The more expensive the resource, the more you start to question if we need it, how much we're spending, and what return we'll get. We're moving in a direction where everything is getting more expensive and staff aren't getting cheaper. Now, closer to today's topic, workforce planning. I said at the beginning that although we call this course rationing and headcount optimization, these are familiar terms, but in global HR, this is an international profession. It's called workforce planning. For example, if you look at books or research on personnel, rationing, headcount optimization, etc. In short, when looking for materials, you'll mostly encounter the term workforce planning. There are related terms, but they're quite rare and not popular. So workforce planning, what is it? It's a systematic, meaning regular, fully integrated organizational process. We'll discuss where exactly it's integrated soon. It includes proactive planning to avoid, this is very important. We'll talk about why this is important, to avoid a surplus or shortage of talent based on business strategy and plans. This business strategy and plans part is key. This is an important point. If there's no business strategy or plans, it's difficult to do strategic workforce planning. It's hard to answer the question whether we'll need more people in a year. I'm not even talking about 3, 5, or 10 years. Whether we'll need fewer people or different kinds of people. So of course, the business strategy and plan is the foundation here. This process is based on the premise or assumption that a company can be staffed more efficiently if it forecasts its talent needs as well as the actual supply of talent that is or will be available. The idea is that often to put the best employee in a position, which is basically the goal of any company, to have every vacant position filled by the best player. It's like in any sport, for example, soccer. The coach and club owner want the best player in every position so the team wins and the club makes money. It's the same in business. The company wants the best employee for every position. And the company engages in staffing these positions, called staffing in English. And this staffing can be done much more effectively if planned in advance, rather than doing it on the spot. For example, we had a vacancy and realized we need to find someone for it. When we have very little time, we don't have the opportunity to find the very best candidates, because these people are already working somewhere. These people don't know anything about us yet. We don't know anything about them, and there are many barriers between us. If we realize now that in a year we'll need, say, 10 engineers, we have a whole year to prepare, to build awareness of our great employer brand, find candidates, target them with ads, invite them to conferences. So when we have more time, we have more opportunities. Then we don't struggle later when we're faced with an urgent need to hire, trying to poach talent somehow. Rationing, optimization, downsizing, succession planning, we could go on, we'll cover this often. There's employer branding, performance management, training, compensation. This is already part of the planning process. These are ways to achieve what you want. These are related processes. But the main process is called strategic workforce planning. That's what it's called. Now let's move on. What problems and challenges does this process solve for a company when it's well organized? Again, international HR assumes that companies have this process in place. So if a company operates more efficiently, it can avoid unnecessary layoffs. It can even reach the desired headcount through natural attrition. So there's no need to pay severance, no need to try to preserve the employer brand by finding decent positions for people, or panic hiring. I don't know if you've encountered it or not. Let's put it this way. If you've encountered panic hiring, give me a plus. I've encountered this when a company is already behind and needs to hire urgently. I was once hired by STB TV channel this way, when the company couldn't keep up with filling a vacancy. Imagine this. I start work as the head of recruitment and onboarding. They certainly told me in the interview, you'll need to build processes, form a team. Well, I start work and begin to learn how things are going. I have one recruiter working, one recruiter on vacation. I ask the recruiter for a list of vacancies. She compiles it. I started on Monday. By Friday, she gives me a report. She has 100 open positions. It's television, journalists, directors, screenwriters, producers. We're already working with some agencies. Some positions have been open for months with angry managers. This is panic hiring. I'm in this panic trying to staff the company, while project launches depend on hiring. They were just launching X Factor and many other large-scale projects. And it's very difficult to clean up this mess. The company simply missed the opportunity to prepare in advance, hire recruiters, build the brand, optimize and build recruiting processes. So this thing is very negative and very stressful and very challenging. Let's move on. By planning ahead, HR can ensure managers and leaders have the right number of people with the necessary skills, which is also important, because providing the right quantity can almost always be done. The question is whether the quality meets expectations, or if leaders are already willing to make any compromises in the right place at the right time. Further, workforce planning would be more accurately called Talent planning because it integrates forecasting elements from each HR function related to talent. That's what I was saying here, that many HR processes are connected to workforce planning. So even these processes become much more deliberate. For example, they often talk about the concept of a talent pool. A talent pool is simply part of the workforce planning system because a pool implies something for the future. So when there's no workforce planning system, there's no understanding of what we need. So there's no understanding of why we need a talent pool, what to do with this pool, how to select people for it, how to develop them, how much to pay them, and so on. Therefore, workforce planning comes first and then everything else. Key elements of workforce planning. Well, first of all, it's a proactive managed process. So it's not a reaction to something, but here we take our future into our own hands and start managing that future. Accordingly, it's future-oriented, often looking beyond a one-year horizon, although operational planning and strategic planning are distinguished. That is, sometimes planning occurs within 1 year, but it usually aligns with longer-term planning. It focuses on critical workforce segments, and we're going to talk about that. Well, for example, if you have a company, I worked at STB TV channel. I could be wrong, of course, but we had about 50 cleaners working for us, 50 people. So a cleaner is a position that's relatively easy to fill. The requirements aren't super high, and the onboarding is simple. There's not much need to plan anything related to cleaners. Well, except to calculate the number of cleaners needed. Okay, there is no need to plan how we will hire them, how we will attract them, and so on. Because for that company, cleaners are not a critical segment of the workforce. A cleaner, as an example, for another company, for a cleaning company, this would be a strategic segment because cleaners are their main staff. So here, of course, it depends on the business. Next, this planning process is integrated into business processes and business planning. That is, ideally, when a company conducts a strategy session or strategic planning, it should then engage in workforce planning, because if we have had a strategy session and planned some ambitious business goals, we have some strategic initiatives and internal projects being launched, and staff is needed for this, but it is all unprepared, especially if these are long-term projects. That is, if the strategy is not for 1 year, but at least for 3 to 5 years, it usually involves more global shifts. If we have not planned the workforce for this, then the entire strategy is at risk of failure. So it is a very important process. And this process is based on facts and figures. There will be a lot of numbers here. In the class about planning and headcount, about optimization, we will be speaking the language of numbers, different formulas, different calculations. So it is not just guesswork. It is based on calculations. Let us move on. Levels of workforce planning. Most likely your company is doing something in this direction to some strategic level. 4 levels are distinguished. How can a company plan? Simple level, just planning vacancies and budget planning. In general, there is little strategy here, few calculations. Just look at how many there were last year, what jobs need to be added, that is it. The second level is when some analytics in the personnel area are already being used. That is, internal personnel are already being analyzed. What kind of people we have, any competencies, performance levels, demographics, and so on. External data on turnover is analyzed, compared, and so on. These are still operational levels. The third and fourth levels are strategic. Level 3 is strategic workforce planning and analytics. Here we are already identifying key segments, so we are no longer treating all staff the same. We realize that some roles are more important than others. Here we are already building different models, predictions, and scenarios. So we're modeling how many people we'll need, depending on various factors, and then seeing the changing data, we understand how many people we really need. And the fourth level is human capital planning. This is the level where we utilize all HR processes to ensure we have the very best staff in a timely manner and at the right cost. Furthermore, through HR workforce planning, it adds value to the company's operations. HR does many things, and workforce planning, as shown here, is one of the most important elements. By doing this, we're creating value for the business, we're delivering benefits, we're justifying the money that's spent on us. Next, how does the planning process work? So that's the high-level overview. We'll explore this in more detail later in the course. First, we need to understand what's happening with the business. Understanding the business is the foundation of everything. Here we need to understand the key business goals and needs, and we usually consider this in the context of various scenarios. Next, we determine who we need based on who we already have. They're asking why everything is in English, but I'm not speaking English. I don't know why you think everything is in English, and this text is not in English. In general, HR professionals should learn English. Can I ask a question? You won't have that problem. So if you don't know English, at least the ability to read it, I definitely recommend developing that skill. Next, in the second stage, we analyze what personnel we have and generally what personnel we will be lacking. In the third step, we do modeling, which means we look at how much it's going to cost us, what quality of staff we need, and where we're going to hire them. Because when we look at things in a more global context, we're thinking not just about how many to hire, but where to hire, because it might be more convenient to hire in a different city than our own, maybe for remote work. And in the fourth step, we take actions related to personnel. Again, this isn't just about hiring, it's the entire employment cycle. Here we apply tools, or more accurately, actions within the framework of a model known as the 6 Bs. B is a really cool model because it's 6 stages of working with personnel, and each one starts with the letter B. What are these stages? It's actually about recruiting personnel. It's about staffing because we don't always have to hire people. We'll talk about that today. It's about nurturing staff, retention, development, and termination. There are various activities we apply to have the staff we need. Let's move on. So why are we taking this so seriously? The fact is that for any company to be successful, it needs certain ingredients. If you're making a Napoleon cake, if you want the cake to be good, you can't make it without using the right ingredients, processes, and equipment. Without these, it won't be a Napoleon or it won't taste as good. The same is true for any company, any business. A business needs certain ingredients. In business, these are commonly referred to as capabilities. I translate this word as opportunity. Some translate it as ability, some use both. Essentially, it's the extent to which we provide one of the key resources for building the business. The company needs people to always be available in the right numbers, with the right skills, with the right qualities. Without this, the company can't plan such actions to develop, can't react to situations, and so on. So in fact, a lot depends on this. For those of you who studied in economics departments, I remember my university education, and we had a book called Economics. I even give it as an example at the end of class as a good book for studying how the economy works. So in any basic economics course in an economics department, you study the classical factors of production. There used to be 4 of them, then they added information. These are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. It's believed that an entrepreneur combines these 4 factors of production to create a product. Labor is the most important factor in this classical concept. We now call this personnel. Personnel is actually the most crucial ingredient for any company. And for some companies, it's one of the most important. For example, take an IT company, some startup. An IT company doesn't own land, they don't need it. Labor is the people, capital is investments, and then there's entrepreneurial ability. Entrepreneurial ability is actually what the founder has, you could say, essentially for free. Capital is costly, and that's a big deal. These are the resources on which everything develops. And then there are the people. So people plus capital equals business, plus the entrepreneurial ability of the person who created it. Therefore, we can say that in a modern company, conventionally speaking, the HR department and the department responsible for attracting investments, often just the CEO, are the 2 most important ingredients. What if the company lacks these capabilities, i.e., HR is not managing personnel effectively? This is the risk that at a certain point in the future, the level of capability will be insufficient to achieve results, which can lead to loss of revenue for the organization. For example, if you have a chain of stores, a business everyone understands, you can't open new stores if you can't hire the right staff on time. And that's something retail often struggles with. Those who work or have worked in retail know firsthand how dependent the company is on hiring, how urgent it is when opening new locations, stores. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Well, understandably, some people are transferred from old stores, creating shortages in the old stores or countries. Besides scarcity, there's another bad situation, an excess of capabilities. That is when there are more of these capabilities than necessary. It would seem like that's great. In reality, these capabilities cost money, they get paid, and that's bad too. If we try to balance this capability, reduce it, it leads to either the need to lay people off or some other problems. So any company tries to maintain a balance to avoid both excess and shortage. And this balancing act depends on the ability to plan staffing. Otherwise, the company will suffer from not having enough people. This doesn't only apply to retail business, it applies to IT companies too. If a company lacks developers, it simply can't release new features and starts losing to competitors. Among many products, such as HR automation or recruiting systems, those who fail to develop new features quickly start to lose out. Therefore, the ability to hire developers, testers, and other team members directly affects the success of the business. On the other hand, again, you can't hire more than you need either. All the investment will be eaten up and there will be no money left for anything. Next, another reason why staff planning is important. Look at this interesting data. What percentage? This is data from SRM. What percentage of personnel costs are in the structure of total operating costs? Nuclear energy, 60%. Healthcare, 52%. Professional services and IT industries, 50%. Airline industry, 33%. Manufacturing, mining, construction, 2%. Retail, 18%. So as we can see, IT companies are very popular right now. As we can see, a lot of money is spent on people, and I think this figure will not decrease. Next, it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to balance how many people are employed with what the company can do with those people. And here, accordingly, are a number of supporting processes that the company manages. This includes proper personnel composition. That is some kind of organizational structure, how they interact with each other. The right number, risk management, cost management, managing your capacity, hiring, downsizing, and location management. That is where these people are located. These are all things that are included in workforce planning. Next, we often talk about personnel as if we automatically think of full-time employees, but it's important to understand that full-time employees are not the only format. Moreover, in the world, companies are trying to move more towards different types of non-permanent temporary staff and varieties of temporary staff because people are very expensive in the world. For example, when I worked at one startup, we had an office in Kyiv, and one of our competitors was in the USA. The competitor had a much higher market share and made more money, but had only 10 people on staff. We were a startup, very small, not making much money, but we already had 100 people. Why? Because we were in Kyiv and they were in the United States. First, the US has more developed all types of temporary staffing. Second, the developer's salary there was $50,000 to $200,000 a year, while ours was 24. That is 5 to 6 times less than they have. That's why the numbers are different. But the world is changing. Wages will go up. They are already growing. They will continue to grow because remote work allows many people to work from any country for the most expensive, most successful companies. That is, a developer, even HR recruiter, can be in Kyiv and work for an American company. Therefore, companies will look more towards temporary staff. There are different types of temporary staff. Here's one type of scheme, but there are, first of all, contractors, so-called freelancers, those who are hired for specific work, usually get paid hourly. There's temporary employment, that is, we hire for a 3-month project. There is on-call employment. We sign a contract but pay when needed. We say you wait, we'll call when needed and pay for actual work. For example, repair staff who do maintenance, we don't need them in the office, but when something breaks, we call them. Part-time employment is also an option. Then there's seasonal work. This applies to, for example, agricultural products, which are very seasonal. Joint employment of leased personnel, when we rent people, we tell the leasing company, give us 100 people for a month. Outsourcing, where we hand over all management entirely. It's popular now to outsource office cleaning and security, so you don't even have to bother with it. Work done for hire, meaning various creative and artistic jobs, where ownership often transfers to the company, and of course, remote employees. In general, there are many types of temporary staff. Now, regarding segmentation, we talked about what it is and why it's needed. Segmentation allows us to understand which employees we're most interested in and which employees we should focus more of our efforts on. Because, as I said, some employees are trivially easy to find and replace. Here's an example of what segmentation might look like. Based on business strategy, we can identify strategic roles that are of key importance. Everything really depends on who we hire for these roles because they're essentially the ones producing something. There are key positions that help us in the business, supporting positions, and positions that may no longer be necessary for the business. We should also understand that the company doesn't aim to keep all its staff year after year. The company's task is to be flexible, survive, and make money. Some staff and roles may cease to be relevant. These roles need to be dealt with in a timely manner. That is, we need to promptly identify roles that are no longer needed and phase them out. The second question is what to do with the people, but if it's all done in advance, solutions are usually found. I once had an interesting project while I was still working at the bank. It was a project about optimization, restructuring the business, a new strategy, and it turned out that a large number of people in different branches across the country were facing layoffs. Their roles were being centralized and even moved to another city. I was still a recruiter then, just starting out. I got this list, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was 350 people, and I had a year to reassign them somewhere. I reported every month on who I had reassigned where. In the end, I think we didn't lay off anyone, or maybe just 1 or 2 people. Working with them, some people naturally quit, some did something else. For most vacancies, there were other fellow recruiters sitting with me, and I offered these people for all the jobs I could to get them employed. Next. When we talk about workforce planning, we definitely use a term like FTE, and I think it's popular, but it's not even translated, although it has a translation, and its translation sounds less euphonious, so I think people will say FTE more often. FTE stands for full-time equivalent, which translates to equivalent of full-time employment, hence, and they also say X-time equivalent, so it's the same thing. So FTE. When we talk about people, we think not so much about individuals as about roles. And we assume that there's a role and there's some standard work schedule, usually 40 hours a week. Now, roles don't always equal people. For example, if you have 2 part-timers working 20 hours each, you'll have one role but two people. It's important to learn to separate these things because they are slightly different. When we deal with more subtle things like staff rationing, we assume that a person typically works 40 hours, but they could work 50 hours and maybe even sometimes 60 hours a week, and we can pay them for it. So we have to think in categories. There's a person who can work different numbers of hours, and there's a role which can also have some variation in content. So it's accepted that there's a role like FTE and it's 40 hours a week. Next, there are varieties of these FTEs. This is just for terminology. You might need it. There's FTE. I'm writing about it here and there. Target FTE is the quantity required, for example, let's say January, that the business needs for January, and that's how many positions are required, as it were. For example, if it's FTE and two people work 20 hours each, it will be two people, of course. Next, there's FTE budgeting. That's how much is allocated in the budget. You probably realize if you've encountered it that companies budget for each person. And an advanced company doesn't just budget for each person, it budgets for salary revisions on an individual basis. Sometimes they budget for vacation pay, that is various additional expenses. So it's a very detailed approach. Then there are TT contracts. This is when you account for how much each person has worked. Next, there's the final FTE. This is when some time has passed, people have worked, and we already account for different overtime and non-overtime hours. There are planned or projected FTEs. This is when we understand how much people are actually working and estimate how many we'll need in the future. For example, if someone is working overtime, effectively doing the work of 1.2 FTEs, we can plan for that continued overtime in our forecasts. There's a planned FTEs. As you can see, these are several different concepts. Today, it's more about understanding that when we talk about workforce size, it's not just about headcount. Because when people talk about the number of employees, they usually mean headcount. And that's simply the number of people. It doesn't matter how many hours they work. When we talk about workforce planning, we use more FTE terminology here, assuming there's a role with standard occupancy, but we understand that it can vary. There might be several part-time employees, there could be overtime or undertime, anything is possible. Let's move on. Workforce planning is not a super simple approach, neither is workforce management. There are many challenges we'll have to face and work with. It would be great if everything could be solved purely mathematically. We planned for 1,500 FTEs on January 1st, and there they are. In reality, it doesn't work that way. Why? Because there are many complexities that companies face. Different generations that need to be reconciled, their needs and interests need to be considered. For example, a highly specialized engineering position might often require very experienced people because it demands expertise, training, and a lot more. In some cases, we need students. Then there's the skills gap. It's often noted that in an ideal world, we imagine an employee with the right skills, but in reality, people with those skills aren't available for that salary. And that's also a problem. What to do? Employee retention. It's not enough to just hire the right number of people and relax. We also need to keep them from leaving. The arrival of global companies that affect salaries and poach employees, the maturing of certain professions. Overall, there are many complexities. It's important to understand that workforce planning is largely a mathematical process to some extent, but this process faces a very non-mathematical reality that often disrupts plans, and we have to reconcile with reality. Next, understanding the essence of the company's staffing needs and availability of personnel. There's one formula considered basic in planning, and it shows a simple example. For example, based on business needs, we know that next year we need to have 2,000 people by the end of the year. The most basic planning would look like this. We look at how many people will quit, how many will retire, how many we currently have, and figure out how many we need to hire. And then we plan how we'll hire them, where to hire them, and how to solve this problem. Here's an example of an internal planning forecast for staff availability. For instance, we have 3 years, current staff, headcount is people, and we understand that due to turnover, this will decrease. That means people will quit. Then there are retirements when people might leave. In our country, people probably don't retire as often as in the rest of the world. Although I think there are students in the company from companies where retirements do happen. Accordingly, we understand that our internal supply, if we ignore the external market and don't fill vacancies, will decrease if we do nothing about it. Next, we can analyze staff dynamics to understand how different positions will be vacated. For example, there are different career levels, hires, exits, and an understanding of balance. These are examples of how a company can work with such data. Next is analysis when the company understands who they need and how many people they'll need by year. There's an understanding of how the current headcount will change, taking into account retirements and resignations, leading to an understanding of how many staff the company will be short, the difference between the target figure and the actual figure. It's called analysis, and then we close this gap using various actions. Gap, you could say it's a gap analysis, an analysis of shortfalls. There are numbers here, there are graphs, which means the graphs make it a little easier to understand the numbers. Next, understanding the external labor market. We must understand that as a company, we're not in ideal conditions where we can hire any staff in any quantity. That doesn't happen. Once, when I worked in television, I had a task like this. We needed to fill first 100 vacancies a month, then 150. Then at some point, the recruiting department had 200 vacancies. I realized that the number of candidates in the market wasn't increasing. Our vacancies were growing. We had 200 vacancies, and I gathered data through the end of the year. We needed to fill about 500 more vacancies. When I saw that 2 vacancies weren't filled, and another 500 would come in, and we were already having difficulties with time to fill for certain positions, I wondered, how are we even going to fill all these vacancies? How many people are in the market? That's where I started thinking beyond just recruitment needs, but in terms of market categories, to ask a question. How many people are in the market? How can I know? So I looked at job sites, statistics, and calculated that in Kyiv, about 10,000 such people work in various TV channels. That's not enough to meet our needs. I mean, we won't get that much from other companies. So I started to plan on the regions, started to plan a strategy of recruiting in the regions, an advertising campaign so that you can go and understand. I mean, that's how it works. We also have to consider the external market. The bigger the company, the higher its appetite in us, the more we have to consider the external market. A company of 10 people basically doesn't care how many people are in the market. She knows she'll find herself 1 person a month or even 2 or 3 months. A company of 1,005, maybe 10,000 people has an understanding that some 2, 3, 500, some employees out there, they may not be in the market. So you have to take into account what is happening in the market. Besides how many people are in the market, you have to consider what's going on out there, what situations, what trends. There are so many events happening around the world right now, and there will be more and more events that will affect the workforce. So to understand the external market, it is very useful to apply a tool, basically such a very famous tool for HR planning, for HR strategy. It is called analysis. PESTLE, because the acronym from the 6 directions, here they are on the screen: politics, economic, society, technology, environment, legislation. And you have to, the bigger the company, the more carefully you have to evaluate the impact of the factors of all 6 and what's going on in each factor on the company and on HR, and in particular on recruitment opportunities. Now, a little bit about current trends. I'm going to make another comment about English here. First of all, I recently did an HR chat poll on English language skills, and I got a big kick out of it, that the level of current knowledge is pretty good. That is, people who can read English perceive the reading of the letter of a word. They are the majority. Next, I would like to remind you once again that all information about HR, research, new approaches come in English. So I think I will try to give some of the research material in English to help you get used to it a little bit. Well, I plan to make other efforts to strengthen your English as well. But nevertheless, I will explain things the way I have explained them before. So, Current Approaches to Workforce Planning is a study by one of the largest HR consulting firms, CIB. So what are they saying? What is the company doing now? 26 Cents engages in strategic workforce planning. That's cool. 33 is just talent forecasting, 32 planning, not strategic, and 3% don't apply anything, which isn't bad in principle. Next, the effectiveness of different personnel planning activities. The first is the most effective. Strategic goal setting, that is where it all starts, because if there is no strategy, no goals, it is difficult to plan anything. Then preparing a staffing plan, needs assessment, analyzing internal facts, internal market. Next, link to business objectives and analyze the external market. That's what preparation. Next is execution. It's the execution plan. It's adjusting it and evaluating how the plan is working. That's what modern companies are doing, as far as they think they are concerned, as effectively as they can. Most companies, as we see, are not very effective in their view at doing most things other than setting goals. So there's a lot to learn here. For how long does the company plan its staff? More than 1 year? More than 1 year, but less than 3 years, and 3 years, but less than 5 years. I mean, the majority are here. For 6 months, here we have less than 6 months here. That is still medium-term planning. The biggest challenges that workforce planning has is the lack of prioritization from management, meaning management doesn't know who they need. Next, how quickly the business environment changes, the lack of methodology, by the way, and the lack of process. This particular course is about giving you a methodology for the staff planning process. I mean, we're right here. Lack of technology. It's such a misfortune too. We have, especially in our space, there are still very few mature HR systems that can plan the workforce. Well, and then there are other lesser complexities. That's what's going on in this world. I hope today's session was able to give you an insight into staff planning. What is it? Why is it? A little bit like this. Well, next we're going to look at how this happens in practice. That is, for example, how to figure out how many people you need next year based on your business goals, how to calculate how much is needed, operators in the call center based on the growing workload. How do you know if people are loaded or unloaded? How to consider people's efficiency, how to reduce quantity and not losing quality. These are the kinds of questions we'll be talking about in class later. Homework for those already on the course: assess at which level of these 4 levels below you have in your company now in personnel planning. Describe what problems the company has because of this level. For example, panic hiring. One of the, I think, will be a popular issue. Panic hiring is when we don't plan, then suddenly we need to find someone who is hard to find quickly. And describe what tasks you would like to accomplish in this course. For example, everyone will have on different tasks. Some will want to try to optimize headcount without losing quality. Some will want to learn how to calculate for new offices, new locations, new staff positions. Someone else might want to learn how to do other things. So it would be interesting to read what tasks you would like to solve to best address your needs. That's the homework assignment. This is where we end. Session 2 will be about what planning and headcount methods exist. That is, how do we manage the need? All the formulas, various forecasts, trends, and so on. We'll cover that in the second session. In the third, we'll learn how to account for staff workload and how to understand how many real people a certain job requires. Fourth, how to optimize. For example, how many people can be reduced if some kind of automation is implemented. The fifth is about efficiency, but it's obvious, for example, that 3 highly efficient recruiters will fill more vacancies than 5 average performers and 10 low performers. Sometimes it's better to hire 3 high performers, pay twice the salary than 10 low performers, and fewer workstations will be used. There will be higher quality, meaning there will be gains beyond just financial ones. And the 6th session is about how to implement the strategy. And we saw through the third class and others, we need to grow by 30 people in some areas. And in some places, we need to cut 20 people and do something else in other areas. And somewhere we need to develop 15 people. How to do all this, what processes to use. We're not going to teach HR processes, but we're going to talk about which HR processes can help and how. For example, succession planning or session plan as it's called. What is it? How can it be useful? How can it be done? It's personnel outplacement. What is it? How is it done? What are its benefits? How to convince management to spend money or resources on it. That's what the 6th session will be like. That's our plan. I promise to recommend books, so there will be an economics book because I quoted today that people are one of the main factors of production. I got that from economics. In general, this system is business-oriented. Today's understanding of business, about contribution to business in favor of business. So I thought that the economics book, if you haven't read it yet, would definitely be helpful to you. It's 2 volumes. I believe it's the 21st edition. It's being passed down, updated, and of the economics books I've come across, it's one of the best. I once enjoyed reading both volumes, so I would recommend it to you too. And besides being about understanding business, it's about understanding economics. I mean, the external market, what's happening there, it covers the basics of supply and demand. Because for talent, for personnel, they also talk about supply. That is, on one hand, there's the company's need, and on the other hand, there's supply, distinguishing between internal supply, current employees, and supply in the labor market, external employees. In short, all these things are very interesting and useful for general development. That's all for today. If you have any questions left other than why everything is in English, ask. If there are no questions, you can write down what was most valuable to you today, what you're taking away, what you're leaving with. Yeah, for those who will watch on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, like the video, you know what to do. I usually talk about the bell, like all that kind of commentary. Positive comments are preferable. So if I'm looking at Facebook and here on Zoom, if there are no questions in the comments, then I hope everything was clear. Thank you all very much for your interest in this topic. You know, I always enjoy seeing people who are interested in more than just basic topics. Not only basic topics, although they're important too, but deeper topics like personnel planning, which is an advanced topic. Thank you all for the comments. Thank you, as always, very interesting and helpful. Thank you very much. It was helpful. Thank you too, and I hope to see you soon. Keep an eye out for announcements of open webinars in the Telegram chat. I will be posting. See you soon. Bye-bye.